My mother-in-law always said I was not worthy of her son. At my husband's funeral, she threw me out of the cemetery, but the next day, a notary came to her and read the will. She grabbed the chair when she found out. Good day, dear listeners. It's Briella again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Claire Whitfield, and I want to tell you a story about the day I was thrown out of my own husband's funeral, and what happened the very next morning. But before I get there, let me take you back. Let me show you what my life looked like before everything fell apart. I met Daniel Hargrove when we were both 26. He was tall, soft-spoken, the kind of man who remembered your coffee order and held doors open without thinking about it. We got married in a small ceremony in Asheville, North Carolina, on a September afternoon when the mountains were just beginning to turn gold. I wore my grandmother's pearl earrings. I cried during the vows. I thought I had found everything. What I had not fully understood, not yet, was that when you marry a man, you sometimes marry his family too, whether you want to or not. Daniel's mother was Margaret Hargrove. She was 63 years old, slim, silver-haired, and possessed of the kind of Southern elegance that functions as a weapon. She wore linen in the summer and wool in the winter, and always had a handkerchief folded in her sleeve. She smiled constantly. That was the thing about Margaret. She always smiled, even when she was saying something that cut you to the bone. She made her position clear within the first month of our marriage. Not loudly, not with a scene. Margaret didn't do scenes. She did quiet asides, small corrections, pointed silences. She told Daniel, within earshot of me, that she worried he had settled. She told me, over sweet tea on her back porch, that she had always imagined Daniel with someone from the area. She asked about my family. My parents were middle class, my father a retired postal worker, my mother a dental hygienist in Ohio, in a tone that made clear she found them wanting. For 11 years I tried. God, how I tried. I brought casseroles to her house. I remembered her birthday, and her sister's birthdays, and the anniversary of her husband's death. I bit my tongue at Christmas dinners when she said things about my cooking or my housekeeping, or the fact that Daniel and I had not yet had children. Such a shame, she would say, looking at me with those pale blue eyes. Daniel would make such a wonderful father. As if the absence of children was my failing alone. Daniel loved his mother. He wasn't blind to her flaws. We talked about it sometimes at night, lying in the dark. But he had been raised by her, shaped by her, and there were certain things he couldn't hear clearly when it came to Margaret. I understood that. I didn't stop loving him for it, but I would be lying if I said it didn't wear on me. Then Daniel got sick. It was a Tuesday in February when he came home from his annual physical looking pale. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 3. The words landed in our kitchen like stones dropped into still water, and everything rippled outward from that moment. The next 18 months were a blur of oncologists and insurance forms and infusion chairs, and trying to hold each other up in the bathroom at 2 in the morning when neither of us could sleep. Margaret, during those months, inserted herself completely. She came to appointments. She called his phone more than I could count. She made decisions about his care, which specialists to consult, whether to pursue a clinical trial in Houston, while I was standing right there in the room, as if I were invisible, as if I were a guest in my own marriage, in my own husband's illness. He died on a Thursday in August. We had 11 years and 4 months together. He was 41 years old. The funeral was held at First Presbyterian Church in Hendersonville, where the Hargrove family had worshipped for 3 generations. I sat in the front row in a black dress, Daniel's hand, no, not his hand anymore, just the thought of his hand, somewhere in my mind as the pastor spoke. And then we went to the cemetery. I was standing at the graveside, my fingers wrapped around a single white rose, when Margaret appeared at my elbow. She didn't raise her voice. She never raised her voice. She leaned close and said, in a tone that was almost gentle, "I think it would be best if you left now, Claire. This is family time." I looked at her. "I am family, Margaret." "You were his wife," she said. "That's over now." There were people around us. Cousins, friends, neighbors. Some of them heard. Some of them looked away. And I, who had nursed her son through 18 months of dying, who had held his hand in every dark hour, I felt something inside me go very, very still. I left the cemetery. I walked to my car. I sat behind the wheel for a long time without starting the engine. I didn't cry. I had done all my crying. What I felt instead was something colder and much more durable. I didn't know yet what the next morning would bring, but Margaret Hargrove had just made the worst mistake of her life. I drove home from the cemetery to a house that was full of Daniel's things and empty of Daniel. His reading glasses were still on the nightstand. His coffee mug, the one that said "World's Most Average Fisherman," a birthday gift from his colleague Jim, was still in the drying rack. The indent his body had left in his side of the mattress had not yet recovered. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom for a long time, just looking. Then I went to the kitchen table, sat down, and began to think. What had I lost? Let me count it out, because I think it matters to name things precisely when you're trying to understand them clearly. I had lost my husband. I had lost 11 years of partnership, of shared grocery lists and inside jokes and the particular comfort of sleeping beside someone who knew you. I had lost the future we had planned, the trip to Portugal we'd booked and then canceled when the diagnosis came, the house in the mountains we talked about retiring to someday. I had lost the small daily architecture of my life. And now Margaret was trying to make me lose something more. My dignity. My place in the story of Daniel's life. My right to stand at his grave. Was I going to allow that? I sat at that kitchen table for 3 hours. I made coffee and didn't drink it. I stared at the wall. I thought about what Margaret had said, and I thought about the way some of the people at the graveside had looked away rather than intervene. And I thought about how easy it would be to simply sink into grief and let her have whatever she was reaching for. But then I thought about something else. Something Daniel had said to me 6 weeks before he died. We were sitting on the back porch in the evening, the way we did when he was feeling well enough, watching the light go off the hills. He had reached over and taken my hand and said, with the particular directness he had developed in those last months when he no longer had energy to waste on indirection, "I've taken care of you, Claire. Promise me you won't let anyone tell you otherwise." I had promised. I hadn't fully understood what he meant at the time. I thought he was talking about emotional support, about not letting grief swallow me. Now, sitting at the kitchen table 24 hours after his burial, I thought perhaps he had meant something more specific. The next morning, there was a knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I was still in yesterday's clothes. I opened the door to find a man in a gray suit holding a leather briefcase who introduced himself as Robert Ellison, attorney at law, from the firm of Ellison and Marsh in Asheville. "Mrs. Hargrove Whitfield," he said. "Yes. I'm the executor of your husband's estate. I've been asked to read the will. I was hoping you'd be available this morning." He paused. "I'm also scheduled to be at Mrs. Margaret Hargrove's residence at 11. She's a secondary beneficiary, and she'll be present for her portion of the reading." I let him in. I made fresh coffee. I sat across from him at the kitchen table where I had spent the night in thought, and I listened. I won't tell you everything in Daniel's will just yet. But I will tell you that by the time Robert Ellison finished speaking, I understood what Daniel had meant on the porch. I understood it completely. And I understood something else. Margaret Hargrove did not yet know what was in that document. She was going to find out at 11 o'clock. And whatever her reaction was, whatever she did next, I needed to be prepared. I asked Robert Ellison 2 questions before he left. First, was the will legally airtight? He said yes. Daniel had worked with the firm for over a year, well before his diagnosis became critical, and every provision had been carefully structured. Second, what were my rights if someone chose to contest it? He explained. I listened carefully. When he left, I sat back down at the table with a notepad and wrote down everything he'd said in clean, clear bullet points. I am a methodical person by nature. I worked as a project manager for a mid-sized construction firm. I was accustomed to tracking moving parts, anticipating obstacles, building contingency plans. Grief had slowed me. Grief had turned my brain to fog for months. But sitting at that table on the morning after Daniel's funeral, with Robert Ellison's words settling into place in my mind, the fog began to lift. Margaret had thrown me out of the cemetery. She had done it publicly. She had done it with witnesses. She had miscalculated badly. My plan was not yet formed. Not fully, not in its details. But its shape was becoming visible, the way a shoreline becomes visible through morning mist as you row toward it. I knew what I had. I knew what I was owed. And I was beginning to understand how to protect it. Step 1. I needed to know exactly what Margaret had been doing during Daniel's illness, not my suspicions. Facts. I picked up the phone and called my friend Patricia, who was a paralegal at a firm in Charlotte. I told her I needed the name of a good estate attorney, not Robert Ellison, who was the estate's executor, and thus not my independent counsel, but someone who worked specifically for me. Patricia gave me a name. I wrote it down. Then I called the number and made an appointment. It was 9:30 in the morning. In 90 minutes, Margaret Hargrove was going to sit in her own living room and hear something that would change everything she thought she knew. I wanted to be ready for what came after. My new attorney was named Sandra Okafor, and she had an office on the 4th floor of a building on College Street in Asheville, with tall windows that looked out over the mountain ridgeline. She was 51, sharp-eyed, unhurried. She had the quality I most needed in another person at that moment. She listened without performing sympathy. I brought her everything I had. The copy of Daniel's will that Robert Ellison had given me. 11 years of tax returns filed jointly. The deed to our house, which was in both our names. The life insurance policy. $250,000, with me listed as sole beneficiary. A document Daniel had updated 8 months before his death. And a folder of printed emails I had saved over the years, almost reflexively, the way you save things, when some part of you has always known that one day you might need them. Sandra read through everything methodically. When she looked up, she said, "Tell me about the mother," I told her. I told her about the 11 years, the quiet cruelties, the insertion into Daniel's medical decisions. I told her about the cemetery. Sandra's expression didn't change. Has she made any claims on the estate since the death? Not formally, the will was only read this morning, but I hesitated. Something Robert Ellison said made me think she was expecting to be the primary beneficiary. Sandra nodded. That's not unusual when a mother has been closely involved in a son's final months. Did she have any formal role? Healthcare proxy? Power of attorney? She tried. Daniel refused. I have the documents. A small pause. Good. Then Sandra said something that changed the texture of the entire conversation. Mrs. Whitfield, I want you to pull your husband's medical records from the last 6 months of his life. All of them. and I want you to request a record of who was listed as his authorized contact at each facility." I looked at her. "Why?" "Because in cases where an estranged family member attempts to contest an estate," Sandra said carefully, "it's common for them to argue that the deceased was unduly influenced by the primary beneficiary, in this case you, or that the deceased lacked testamentary capacity. If Mrs. Hargrove intends to contest, she will need a theory. I want to know what she has access to before she decides what that theory is." This was the first moment I felt the ground shift. Not against me, but toward something solid. Sandra wasn't reacting. She was anticipating. That was exactly what I needed. I filed the medical records request that afternoon. What came back 10 days later told me something I hadn't known. In the last 4 months of Daniel's life, someone had called his oncology team 7 times requesting updates on his condition. The calls had been made by a woman who identified herself as Daniel Hargrove's next of kin. That woman was not me. It was Margaret. In 2 of those calls, and the nursing staff had noted this in the records, flagged it internally because it had raised a concern. Margaret had described herself as Daniel's primary caregiver and had asked whether his cognitive state was still reliable. One of the nurses had documented the calls as unusual and had mentioned them to Daniel's attending physician, who had in turn spoken with Daniel directly. Daniel had responded by having the nursing staff add a formal note to his file. No medical information was to be shared with anyone except his wife. That note was dated 11 months before his death. It was in the records. I sat in Sandra's office with those pages in my hands and felt something move through me. Not quite anger, not quite grief. Something more like clarity. Margaret had not just been difficult, not just been intrusive in the ambient way of a controlling mother-in-law. She had been actively working in Daniel's final months to position herself, to establish herself as his primary person. And she had done it while he was dying. Had Daniel known? He had known enough to block her formally. But had he known the full shape of what she'd been doing? I thought about the night on the porch, his hand in mine. "I've taken care of you, Claire." Had he been trying to tell me something he couldn't say directly? I didn't know. But what I had in my hands was real. It was documented. It was a point of no return, because once you see something clearly, you cannot unsee it. Sandra filed a formal letter that week. Not a lawsuit. Not yet. A letter to Robert Ellison as executor, formally noting that Claire Whitfield was represented by independent counsel and requesting that any communications regarding the estate be directed through Sandra's office. The letter was entirely routine, entirely legal, entirely unremarkable in the mechanics of estate administration. But Margaret got a copy, as a secondary beneficiary. And within 48 hours, I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, there was a pause, and then Margaret's voice, stripped of its usual smoothness. "What do you think you're doing, Claire?" I hadn't heard that tone from her before. The smile was gone. What was underneath it was something colder and less refined. "I'm working with my attorney," I said. "Standard procedure." Another pause. "You should think carefully about the position you're putting yourself in," I said very calmly. "I'll pass that along to Sandra." And I hung up. My hands were steady. I noticed that. My hands were completely steady. The plan, fully formed by now, had 3 parts. The first was legal and defensive, to ensure that everything Daniel had left me was protected against any attempt at contestation. Sandra was handling this. The will was airtight, but airtight documents still require defense if someone with money and motivation decides to push. We had requested the medical records. We had documented Margaret's unauthorized calls. We had a paper trail that told a coherent story about a man who knew exactly what he wanted and had taken deliberate steps to make it happen. The second part was financial. Daniel's estate, the house, the life insurance, his retirement accounts, a modest investment portfolio, was substantial enough that Margaret, who had spent her life managing the Hargrove name and its associated sense of entitlement, would feel its absence acutely. She had presumably expected to inherit. She had not. Her portion of the will was a single bequest: Daniel's grandfather's watch and a collection of family photographs. Everything else came to me. The third part was the part Margaret didn't know about yet. During his illness, Daniel had done something that I had known about at the time, but had not fully understood the significance of. He had contacted his father's former business partner, a man named Gerald Stein, who had remained close to Daniel throughout his adult life despite Margaret's long-standing hostility toward him. Through Gerald, and through the attorneys at Ellison and Marsh, Daniel had quietly established a small charitable trust, $20,000 set aside before his death, in memory of his father, a man Margaret had controlled and diminished for 30 years before his early death. The trust was to be administered by Gerald and by me, jointly. Margaret had been excluded entirely, by name, when Robert Ellison read that provision to her, and I heard about it secondhand from Gerald, who had been present. She had gone white. She had grabbed the arm of her chair. She had said very quietly that there must be a mistake. There was no mistake. Within a week of the will reading, I received a letter from a firm in Charlotte, not Sandra's firm, a different firm, representing Margaret Hargrove. The letter alleged that Daniel had lacked testamentary capacity at the time the will was finalized, and that Claire Whitfield had exerted undue influence over her husband during his illness. It threatened to file a formal contest with the probate court if I did not agree to a meeting to renegotiate the distribution of the estate. I sat with that letter for about 30 seconds. Then I photographed it, emailed the photograph to Sandra, and waited. Sandra called me within the hour. Her voice was composed. "This is predictable," she said. "Don't respond. Don't call her. Don't engage in any way. Let me handle it." What I hadn't anticipated was what came next. 2 days after the letter arrived, Margaret appeared at my door. Not alone. She brought her sister, Diane, a woman who had always regarded me with barely disguised contempt. They stood on my porch in their good clothes, and Margaret asked in her sweetest voice if they could come in and talk. I stood in the doorway, and I looked at her. "My attorney has advised me not to discuss the estate with you directly." "This isn't about the estate," Margaret said. "This is about family." "You told me at Daniel's grave that I was no longer family." Diane started to say something. Margaret stopped her with a hand on her arm. Then she looked at me with those pale eyes and said, "I know you're upset, Claire. But what you're doing, pursuing this legally, it will destroy whatever relationship we have left. Is that what you want? Is that what Daniel would have wanted?" And there it was. The invocation of Daniel's name as a weapon. The suggestion that protecting my legal rights was somehow a betrayal of his memory. The implication that family loyalty, their definition of family, their terms, should override everything he had deliberately and carefully arranged. Was I supposed to feel guilty? Was I supposed to open the door and offer them tea and make it easy for them? "Goodbye, Margaret," I said, and I closed the door. I heard Diane say something sharp on the other side, then footsteps on the porch stairs, then silence. That night, after they were gone, I drove to a state park about 30 minutes from town and walked a trail I used to hike with Daniel in the early years of our marriage. It was a Tuesday evening in late August, and the forest smelled like damp earth and pine. I walked until my legs ached and my mind went quiet. I took 3 days. I slept. I ate. I called my mother in Ohio and listened to her voice. I did not think about Margaret. Then I went back to work. On the 4th day, I got a different kind of message. It didn't come from Margaret directly. It came from a woman named Linda Beaumont, who had been a friend of Daniel's family for years, the kind of person who occupied the outer ring of the Hargrove social world, who came to their parties and brought their preferred wine and laughed at the right moments. I had always found Linda pleasant enough in a surface way, the kind of pleasant that required nothing and offered nothing in return. Linda called my cell phone on a Wednesday morning and asked if I'd like to have lunch. I said yes, out of curiosity as much as anything else. We met at a restaurant in downtown Hendersonville, one of those white tablecloth places with good bread and quiet corners. Linda was well-dressed and warm, and for the first 15 minutes, we talked about nothing. About grief, about how I was managing, about the particular loneliness of the period after a funeral, when everyone else's life resumes its normal speed. And then she said, gently, as if it had just occurred to her, "Margaret is really struggling, Claire. I think she genuinely doesn't understand why things have become so adversarial. She feels like she's lost both Daniel and you." I looked at her across the table. I picked up my water glass. I set it down. "Linda," I said, "did Margaret ask you to talk to me?" A pause, half a second too long. "I just thought a conversation might help. I appreciate you thinking of me," I said. "But there's an active legal matter and I can't discuss it. I hope you understand." Linda tried once more. Something about how things could be resolved without courts, about how Daniel wouldn't have wanted this. And I let her finish, and then I said, "I think Daniel arranged things exactly the way he wanted them. I trust his judgment." Then I changed the subject. We finished lunch. I paid my half. I was perfectly cordial. And when I got back to my car, I sat for a moment and thought, so that's what they're doing now. They had tried the letter. They had tried the doorstep visit. Now they were trying social intermediaries, people who could approach me with the appearance of neutrality and deliver the message that resistance was costly and unnecessary and not what Daniel would have wanted. They were watching to see if I would break. I sent Sandra a text describing the lunch. She responded, "Noted. Keep a record of any contact, direct or indirect." I started keeping a log. Date, person, content, context. Clean, factual, documented. But I want to be honest about something. The days after Margaret's visit, and then Linda's lunch, were not easy. The legal process was grinding forward with its own logic, but I was still a woman alone in a house full of someone I loved who was no longer there. I was still waking at 3 in the morning. I was still finding his handwriting on old grocery lists tucked into jacket pockets. Grief and resolve were not opposing forces. They ran alongside each other, and some days one was louder than the other. What helped, genuinely, was people. My friend, Jess, who had known me since college and lived 40 minutes away in Brevard, started coming over on Thursday evenings. She'd bring food. Nothing fancy, pasta or soup. And we'd sit on the back porch the way Daniel and I used to, and she would let me talk or not talk, whichever I needed. She never once told me to settle, to compromise, to consider Margaret's feelings. She just bore witness, which is the most useful thing one person can do for another. My colleague Marcus, who worked in the same project management division and had lost his own father to cancer 2 years earlier, checked in by text every few days. Not long messages, just thinking of you, or how's the week going? The small, steady signals that remind you that you're still visible, still connected. And my mother who had never liked Margaret from the first time she met her, who had said to me once, many years ago, with her Ohio directness. "That woman doesn't see you, Claire." My mother called every morning for a month. Some mornings we talked for 10 minutes, some for an hour. She never offered advice unless I asked for it. She just called. This is what I want to say about that period. The antagonists were relying on my isolation. They expected that grief had softened me, thinned my social connections, made me vulnerable to pressure from the only people still paying attention to me. They did not account for the fact that grief had also burned away everything unnecessary and left behind something clarified and strong. I was not isolated. I was held. And I was watching them just as carefully as they were watching me. They came on a Saturday morning, 6 weeks after the funeral. I saw the car first. Margaret's silver Lexus, pulling slowly into my driveway at 9:15. I was standing at the kitchen window with my coffee, and I watched it park and watched both doors open. Margaret on the driver's side, Diane on the passenger's. They were dressed carefully, not formally. This had been calibrated. Neat sweaters, sensible shoes. Nothing confrontational in the optics. They were dressed for a conversation between reasonable women. I took a breath. I set down my coffee. I walked to the front door and opened it before they could knock. "Good morning," Margaret said. She was smiling. It was the old smile, the one she had been using for 30 years. "I hope we're not too early. I should have called." "You should have," I said. "What do you need?" Diane flinched slightly at the directness. Margaret did not. "We'd just like to talk," Margaret said. "Just the three of us without lawyers, the way Daniel would have wanted." The second invocation of his name in 6 weeks. I noted it. I let them in. I didn't offer coffee. I led them to the living room and sat in the armchair, the one that had always been mine, and waited. Margaret sat on the sofa. Diane sat beside her. Margaret folded her hands in her lap and looked at me with an expression of careful, performed sadness. "Claire," she began, "I know I hurt you at the cemetery. I want you to know I've thought about it a great deal. Grief makes us say things we don't mean." I didn't respond to that. I waited. "I think," she continued, her voice modulating toward gentle reason, "that this legal process is doing neither of us any good. It's expensive, it's painful, and frankly, it's public. People talk. I don't think you want to be known as the woman who fought her mother-in-law in court over her son's grave." There it was. Not quite a threat, but the shape of one. The suggestion that my reputation was at risk, that people were talking, that there was a version of this story in which I was the villain. Was she right that people talk? Of course she was. Some of them already were. I'd heard it secondhand. Whispers about how difficult I was being, how I wasn't allowing the family to grieve. It had stung when I first heard it. It still stung, a little, if I'm honest. But I thought about Sandra. I thought about the medical records, the documented calls, the note Daniel had placed in his own file 11 months before he died. I thought about the fact that Margaret had stood at her son's graveside and told his wife to leave. What version of events was she proposing? Diane spoke then for the first time. "We're not asking for much," she said. "Margaret is his mother. There are things that belong with the family, photographs, pieces of furniture that have been in the Hargrove family for generations, that Daniel couldn't have thought through clearly when he made these arrangements. He was ill. He was under enormous stress. Whatever you think of Margaret, she deserves to have something of her son." "She has the watch," I said, "and the photographs. Daniel specified that, clearly and legally." Margaret's expression shifted, just slightly, just for a moment. The sadness cracked and something harder showed through. "You could be generous," she said. The word generous in her mouth had a particular weight, as if I were the one being uncharitable, as if Daniel's deliberate choices were merely a starting point for negotiation. "I'm protecting the arrangements my husband made," I said. "I don't see that as a failure of generosity." A silence fell over the room. Diane pressed her lips together. Margaret looked at me for a long moment, and in that moment I saw, perhaps more clearly than I ever had, what lay beneath the silver hair and the linen and the perpetual smile. This was a woman who had never in her life been told no by someone she considered beneath her. And I had been telling her no in every way available to me for 6 weeks. "If you continue with this," Margaret said, her voice dropping to something very quiet, "you will make an enemy you cannot afford, Claire." I held her gaze. My heart was beating faster than I would have liked. There was fear there, real, physical fear, the kind that lives in the body. But I had learned in the past weeks that fear and decision can coexist, that one does not have to eliminate the other. "I'll walk you out," I said. They left. The silver Lexus backed out of my driveway and disappeared. I stood at the window for a long moment, watching the empty street. My hands were shaking, just slightly. I pressed them flat against the windowsill and breathed. Then I went to my desk, opened my log, and wrote down everything they'd said. Every word, every implication. Evidence is not only for courts. Sometimes it's for yourself. Sometimes you need the written record to remind you, on the hard days, that you are not imagining what is being done to you. The fear was real, but so was what I was fighting for, and the shaking stopped. The probate hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in October, 8 weeks after Daniel's death. I arrived at the courthouse in Asheville 20 minutes early, with Sandra at my side, wearing the gray blazer I had bought for the occasion. Not because I believed courtrooms rewarded fashion, but because I needed to feel like myself, grounded and deliberate, not hollowed out by grief. I had slept 6 hours, which was better than most nights. I had eaten breakfast. I had called my mother. Margaret arrived with her attorney, a man named Forsyth, older than Sandra, silver-haired himself, the kind of lawyer who had spent his career being imposing, and with Diane, who had apparently been listed as a witness. They took their seats across from us at the table. Margaret looked at me once, with the expression I had come to recognize as her version of composure, and then looked away. She was dressed in black, which I noticed. A deliberate choice. She wanted to look like the grieving mother. She wanted everyone in that room to see her that way first, before anything else was said. I had worn gray. I wanted to look like a woman who had come to present facts. The proceeding was not a full trial. It was a hearing before a probate judge to assess the grounds of Margaret's contest, whether she had sufficient evidence to allege lack of testamentary capacity or undue influence. If the judge found the claim credible, the matter would proceed to trial. If not, the contest would be dismissed. Forsyth presented his case first. He was skilled. He spoke about Daniel's deteriorating condition in his final months, about the profound stress of his illness, about the documented involvement of Claire Whitfield in all medical decisions, as if involvement in your dying husband's care were evidence of manipulation. He introduced 2 witnesses, a neighbor who said she had seen me limiting visitors to our home, and Diane, who described Margaret's relationship with Daniel as central and primary, and said he had always relied on his mother. I sat through it. Sandra made notes. I kept my expression neutral. Then it was our turn. Sandra did not begin with arguments. She began with documents. First, Daniel's will, dated 14 months before his death, with the signatures of 2 independent witnesses and a notarized addendum from his attorney, confirming that Daniel had reviewed and confirmed the document 8 months before his death. Months, Sandra noted, after his diagnosis, when his condition was already known and serious. Testamentary capacity had not been in doubt. It had been formally affirmed. Second, the medical records. The 7 documented calls from Margaret to Daniel's oncology team in his final 4 months, in which she had identified herself as next of kin and as his primary caregiver. The nursing staff's notes flagging these calls as unusual. The note in Daniel's own file, placed there at his explicit request, barring Margaret from receiving medical information. The date of that note, 11 months before his death, long before his condition became critical. Third, the correspondence. The letter from Forsyth's firm threatening contest, and, placed beside it, a printout of Margaret's phone call to me, the one she had made 2 days after receiving Sandra's routine legal letter, the one in which she had said, "You should think carefully about the position you're putting yourself in." I had recorded it. In North Carolina, which is a one-party consent state, that recording was entirely legal. Sandra had it transcribed and printed on clean white paper, and she placed it in front of the judge without drama, without flourish, the way you place something that speaks entirely for itself. The judge read the documents. He asked Forsyth several questions. Forsyth answered with the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to controlling a room. Then the judge asked Margaret directly to explain the phone calls to the oncology team. And this is where Margaret Hargrove, for the first time in my experience of her, lost the thread. She said she had called as a concerned mother. The judge asked why she had identified herself as his primary caregiver. She said that was a misunderstanding, a miscommunication. The word she used specifically was miscommunication. The judge asked how a caller identifies themselves as primary caregiver by miscommunication. Margaret said the nursing staff must have written it down incorrectly. The judge looked at her. On 2 separate occasions, documented by 2 different staff members, Margaret said she couldn't explain that. There was a silence in the room then. Not long, perhaps 4 or 5 seconds. But the quality of it was particular. It was the silence of a story collapsing. Margaret had walked into that courtroom with a narrative. Devoted mother excluded from her son's final chapter by a manipulative wife. The documents had not argued against that narrative. They had simply made it impossible. And now the judge was watching her try to account for facts that her narrative could not absorb, and there was nothing left for her to do but sit with the contradiction in front of everyone. I did not look away from her. I want to be honest about that. I looked at her steadily, the way she had never once looked at me, as if I were fully real, fully present, fully worth seeing. She did not meet my eyes. Diane, on the stand, said she didn't know the details of those calls. She said she had only been reporting what Daniel had told her personally, that he relied on his mother. The judge asked when Daniel had said this. Diane said it was during a visit around Christmas. Sandra asked on cross, which Christmas? Diane said she wasn't certain of the exact year. Sandra produced Daniel's calendar for the last 3 years, showing no recorded visit from Diane in the December period of any of them. Diane said Daniel must have come to her. Sandra asked where. Diane looked at her hands. Forsyth objected. The judge sustained it, but the damage was done. Margaret's attorney had built a case on the premise that Daniel was a diminished man under his wife's control, a man whose primary relationship was with his mother. The documents said otherwise. The records said otherwise. Daniel himself, in 11 months of careful preparation, had said otherwise. I watched Margaret's face during the final 20 minutes of that hearing. The composure held. She was skilled. She had practiced. But something underneath it had begun to fracture, like ice under weight. Not dramatically, but inevitably. When the judge said quietly that he found insufficient grounds to proceed with the contest and that the estate would be administered as written, I felt Sandra's hand briefly touch my arm. I did not cry. I did not react. I sat very still, with my hands folded on the table in front of me, and I breathed. The judge's decision was issued in writing 3 days after the hearing. Sandra called me the morning it arrived and read me the key paragraph over the phone, and then I sat quietly for a while after we hung up and let it settle. The contest was dismissed. The will stood in its entirety, exactly as Daniel had written it. The house was mine. The life insurance was mine. The investment accounts were mine. The charitable trust, in the name of his father, would be administered by Gerald Stein and by me, just as Daniel had intended. Margaret received what Daniel had left her, his grandfather's watch and the family photographs. Nothing more. But the story didn't end with the judge's decision, because legal defeat and human defeat are not the same thing, and Margaret had not yet accepted both. Her attorney filed a motion for reconsideration within the week. It was thin. Even Forsyth must have known it. But it was the available mechanism, and she used it. Sandra handled the response. 2 weeks later, the motion was denied. Forsyth sent a brief letter afterward to Sandra's office indicating that his client was considering further options. Sandra sent a response that was, in legal terms, quite short, and in plain terms communicated that any further unfounded legal action would expose Mrs. Hargrove to sanctions for harassment of the estate. The further options did not materialize. There was one more attempt. Not legal, this time. About a month after the motion was denied, I received a long email from Margaret. It was the most unguarded thing she had ever written to me. 3 pages, single-spaced, oscillating between accusation and self-pity. She wrote that I had taken her son from her long before he died. She wrote that I had poisoned Daniel against his family. She wrote that I didn't deserve what he had given me. She wrote that she hoped I understood what I had done. I read it once. I noticed with some detachment that she had not once in those 3 pages asked how I was doing. She had not once acknowledged the 18 months I had spent caring for her son. She had not once said his name without attaching it to her own loss, her own grief, her own sense of injury. Every sentence curved back to Margaret. Even in mourning, even in defeat, the center of every story she told was herself. I forwarded the email to Sandra, who noted it for the record. Then I did not respond. What would responding have accomplished? Margaret needed someone to receive her anger and reflect it back as guilt. I had spent 11 years being that person. I was done. But I want to tell you about one more thing that happened, because I think it matters. 3 weeks after the email, I called Gerald Stein, and we met for coffee to talk about the charitable trust, how to structure it, what causes Daniel's father would have supported, what timeline we were working with. Gerald had known Daniel since he was a young man, and he had known Margaret since long before that. And over coffee, he said something I have thought about many times since. He said, Daniel always knew what his mother was. He knew it clearly. He just loved her anyway. But he also spent the last 2 years of his life making sure you were protected from her. He was very deliberate about it. I asked Gerald if Daniel had ever talked about the exclusion, about leaving Margaret only the watch and the photographs. Gerald looked out the window for a moment. He said the photographs were what mattered. He said the money and the property were things, and he wanted them with you. but the photographs were his mother's. Her history with him. He said she could have those. He paused. He wasn't punishing her, Claire. He was just telling the truth about what belonged where. I thought about that for a long time afterward. Daniel had not been a vindictive man. He had been a precise one. He had looked at his life with clear eyes in his final months and arranged things according to what was real and true, not according to what anyone expected or demanded. His mother had spent decades demanding the primary role in his life. He had loved her, and he had also quietly, firmly arranged the world to reflect the truth. That I was his family. That his choices were his own. Margaret hadn't lost because I outmaneuvered her, exactly. She had lost because she had misread her son, had believed her own narrative about him so completely that she hadn't understood what he was doing until it was done. She had spent 30 years constructing a version of Daniel in which she was indispensable, and he had spent the last 14 months of his life quietly, legally, and with full mental clarity, writing a different version. The version that was true. That is not a small thing. That is perhaps the most devastating form of defeat available to a person like Margaret, not being overpowered, but being simply, accurately seen through. The last legal document from Forsyth's office arrived in Sandra's mailbox in December, 4 months after Daniel's funeral. It was a formal withdrawal of all claims and a release of any further interest in the estate. Sandra called me with the news while I was at the grocery store, standing in the produce aisle. I thanked her. I put a bag of apples in my cart. I stood there for a moment in the middle of the ordinary lit-up evening of a grocery store, and I thought, it's over. Then I finished my shopping and went home. I stayed in the house for another year, and then I made a decision. I sold it. Not because I couldn't bear to be there. I had made a kind of peace with the house, with Daniel's presence in it, which had shifted from painful to something more like companionship over time. I sold it because I had always wanted to live somewhere that felt like mine, not like the shape of someone else's life that I had moved into. Daniel and I had always talked about the mountains. I found a smaller house, older, with wide plank floors and a covered porch and a view of the ridge from the kitchen window, about 20 minutes outside of Asheville. I bought it with my own name on the deed. I painted the porch door red. The charitable trust, Daniel's father's memorial fund, found its focus in the first year. We partnered with a hospice organization in Western North Carolina, funding a program that provided in-home care support for families of terminal patients. It felt right, in a way that was hard to articulate. Daniel's illness had taught me, among other things, how much the families of dying people needed support. Not just the patients, but the ones sitting in the waiting rooms, sleeping in the hospital chairs, managing the insurance calls at midnight. The trust couldn't do everything, but it could do something real. I went back to work full-time 6 months after the hearing. My firm had been patient with me. I repaid them with the best project management I had ever done, because something about the preceding year had sharpened my thinking in ways I hadn't expected. When you spend months building a careful, documented, contingency-planned defense of your own life, it recalibrates your professional instincts. I understood what mattered and what was noise. I made better decisions. I was promoted within 18 months. Jess came to visit the new house the first weekend after I moved in. We sat on the porch and drank wine and watched the ridge go dark against the sky, and she said, "You look like yourself again." I thought about what that meant. I thought about who I had been before the years of Margaret's quiet damage. The small, steady erosion of being told in 100 different ways that you were insufficient, that you did not belong, that your place was contingent. I was 38 years old. I had a long way to go. That felt, for the first time in a long time, like a good thing. As for Margaret, I did not watch what happened to her. I did not seek out information about her life, and I did not take pleasure in bad news about people as a general rule. But small towns have long memories and mutual acquaintances, and things found their way to me. The legal proceedings had been expensive. Forsyth's fees, the filing costs, the motion and its response. It had run, by some accounts, to nearly $40,000. Money Margaret had not budgeted for because she had expected to win. She had liquidated part of her own savings. The house she had lived in for 30 years, the Hargrove family home, had a mortgage she had apparently been managing with difficulty for some time. The legal costs pushed her into a position where she had to take in a tenant. Gerald told me, without editorializing, that she and Diane had had a significant falling out within 6 months of the hearing. Some dispute about how the family should have handled things. Some reassignment of blame. Gerald didn't know the details, and I didn't ask. The watch, Daniel's grandfather's watch, a beautiful old Longines, silver with a white face. She apparently sold it within a year. Someone I knew spotted it in a jewelry store in Hendersonville with a price tag on it. I didn't ask who bought it. I hoped whoever wore it treated it well. Here is what I want to say about this. I did not feel satisfaction at Margaret's difficulties, not the way I might have expected to. What I felt was closer to a kind of exhausted sorrow. She had been given her son's photographs, his entire visual history with her, every image of the boy he had been and the man he had become. She had chosen instead to spend the inheritance she had anticipated on a legal battle she couldn't win, against a will that her son had written with clear eyes and deliberate hands. She had been fighting me, but Daniel had been the one who made the decisions. I thought about that sometimes, in the evenings on my red-doored porch. I thought about what it must feel like to realize, too late, that the story you had been telling yourself about your own importance in someone's life was not the story they had been living. I didn't have an answer. I wasn't sure there was one. I just kept going forward, which seemed like the only real option anyone has. I learned this. Grief doesn't weaken you. It clarifies you. I learned that love is not proved by submission, and family is not proved by blood. Daniel showed me that. His quiet, deliberate choices showed me that. I learned that the most powerful thing you can do when someone tries to erase you is simply not to be erased. If someone had told you to leave your own husband's funeral, what would you have done? I'd love to know. Leave a comment. And if this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for being here.